In this section, we're going to look at outsider artists. And one thing to remind you of in this section is that there is no reading in the book. The only content is going to be based on uh, looking at the links on the syllabus, listening to this video, and taking the quiz. And there's also no additional video summary quiz like there are with the reading chapters. This is the only one you have for this section. And also, let's define this idea of outsider. So it's maybe not the best term, but the one that most everybody agrees on these days to describe an artist who was not formally trained as an artist. They didn't go to school. They just took up art because it was something important to them. The women in Gee's Bend, Alabama would be a great example of that. Of course, they were trained by their mothers or other women in the community, but they don't have any formal training. One thing, too, that I want to point out is we're going to be looking at 6 different artists, and 3 of them are people who clearly had some kind of mental illness. They struggled with some kind of behavioral problem. For Martin Ramirez and Adolf Wolfley, they were in an institution most of their adult life. It's a kind of a sad chapter. Fortunately, in our country, we don't deal with the mentally ill that way any longer, but they spent a good portion of their life in an institution. Henry Darger was quite an anonymous person. Nobody even knew he made art until after he died. He probably did have some issues that he wrestled with throughout his life. We'll look at his work in a little more detail in a second. Another person we're looking at is the work of Judith Scott. Judith Scott is different because she had a developmental disability. She had Down syndrome, and this was something that she was born with. It's not a behavioral problem. Then the other 2 artists, Howard Finster and Simon Rodia, were both outsider artists. They were untrained, but they have something in common, that they saw the work that they did as a spiritual calling. So that's just a way to outline these 6 artists. Another question to ask yourself as you're looking at these works, because some of them are pretty challenging. Henry Darger had some things in his art that were quite violent. As you can see, exclusively uses girls as innocent aspects of his work, and men, adult men, as the perpetrators of really horrible things. It's really easy to judge work like this and just look at it as being horrible and that he was perverted, but I think a much more interesting question to ask is, what did the art making process do for Henry Darger? It was obviously something that was terribly important to him. He made thousands of paintings. The book that you saw right here, The Realms of the Unreal, actually that's not the book, that's his scrapbook with all the kind of source material that he put in it. Henry Darger wrote a 15,000 page book. He worked on art every night of his adult life, and yet nobody knew anything about it. He was a janitor at a convent his whole adult life. So he went to Mass several times a week. He considered himself a devout Catholic. And so he used this work, it seems, as a catharsis, as a way to get the demons out of him. So art here plays a really deeply human kind of role for a man like Henry Darger. So again, just like Jackson Pollock's splatter paintings, it's easy to look at that kind of work and just dismiss it or judge it negatively, but Henry Darger needed art. Martin Ramirez is another person who, it seems, really needed art, maybe to survive the circumstances he was in the institution that he was in, to express himself in ways that he couldn't verbally. Apparently he barely spoke, so this really was his way of communicating with the world. And like the women of Gee's Bend, once he was discovered. He's really an important 20th century artist. He was doing something very different and really captivating than other modern artists. I think this is a good reason why outsider artists are looked at these days, is that they have a vision perhaps that trained artists just don't have. So they're very inspirational to artists that are trained. Judith Scott's work, as I mentioned, she herself lived in an institution until her sister got her out of it as an adult, and she immediately began making art. She was fortunate enough to end up at this art school. So she worked daily in the latter part of her life making these sculptures. I did the math on one time in terms of how many she made and in what period of time, and by my calculation she would have had to be working on several of these sculptures simultaneously, and made 2 or 3 a week for the remaining part of her life. So she was incredibly productive. And then we can have a look here at Adolf Wolfli's work. Adolf Wolfli is, of these artists, goes the farthest back. These were in the early parts of the 20th century. There's Mr. Wolfli, who was in Switzerland, not the United States, but also made art on a daily basis, and as you can see, it's very intricate. One of the things I noticed after looking at Wolfli's art for a while is that I'm guessing he worked much like the Buddhist monks working on sand mandalas. And you'll notice that there is really no top or bottom to any of these works, that there's always something on the side. You could rotate this 90 degrees and it would appear to be in the right direction. Rotate it again and it would still appear to be in the right direction. So my guess is that he worked on these drawings from all sides. And can say the same thing of Adolf Wolfli. Like, this was therapy for him. This was a way for him to express himself. He also wrote a very elaborate book and used these as illustrations for that book. And then I'll go back to Henry Darger here for a minute. As the video points out, he over time experimented with a number of really innovative techniques, enlarging images, collage, tracing, working with different kinds of colored pigments. If I show you his images on another website source, you can see that he painted dozens of these panorama type paintings. These are painted on brown paper. If the short dimension of this was probably a yard wide, this is the kind of brown paper on a roll. And so many of these are 8 or 10 feet long. And because he was limited in the materials that he could use, he often painted a mural on one side and then turned it over and painted a mural on the other side. So he was incredibly prolific. The reading I've done on him, there's suggested that perhaps he was sexually assaulted as a boy. It's possible that he really was not familiar with the anatomy of women, so girls with penises was normal. So again, it's really important to look at the work of Henry Darger not from a standpoint of judgment, but maybe curiosity, and to see that art played a terribly important part in his life.